이제부터 본격적인 세션에 들어갑니다. 첫 번째 발표는 영국 베이즈 비즈니스 스쿨의 니코스 노미코스 교수님의 ESG와 해양금융 시장의 변화입니다. 시차 관계상 우선 영상으로 발표 내용을 듣고 이후 토론 세션이 시작할 무렵에 잠깐 Q&A 시간을 통해서 실시간으로 소통하는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Niikos Nomikos from Bayes Business School in London. It is a very great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon addressing this very important industry event. I'm so sorry I cannot be with you this afternoon in person. I had some commitments in London which did not allow me to travel to Korea, but I hope to be able to convey my messages during the presentation, and then I will look forward to the Q&A session that will take place after the end of the presentation. The topic of my presentation is about ESG investment and shipping finance. I'll give you very briefly some of the ideas that I will be covering in the next 25 minutes or so. So I'm going to start first of all by looking as to why should shipping investors, or why should investors in general, look at shipping. I will focus in particular on the role of institutional investors, which I think are a very important player, not only in terms of attracting new capital into shipping, but also in terms of driving innovation in shipping. I'm going to examine the key principles of ESG investment. And finally, I will focus a little bit more on the E of the ESG by looking at how decarbonizing shipping and investment can change the industry. Before I go through the details, let me just first of all explain very, very briefly as to why shipping should be a very important and interesting market for shipping investors. As an academic, I tend to do quite a lot of research looking at the characteristics of freight rates, the volatility of the freight markets, and the unique idiosyncratic features of this sector. And what is very interesting is that although freight rates are a commodity, is an asset class that is linked directly with the world economy, tends to move in a slightly different way compared to other commodities. So freight rates can fall in an environment of expanding commodities demand, as well as vice versa. Overall, this creates an environment and a situation where the correlation between freight rates and other commodities tends to be historically very low. And interestingly, you can have situations where, on average, both the expected return as well as the risk tends to be higher compared to what is the case with other markets. As such, freight rates and more broadly shipping investments can form a very good diversifier in a typical investment portfolio. That's why, therefore, they should be looked at carefully when one is designing investment strategies or how to allocate funds to different asset classes. Equally important in that respect is the availability of investment in shipping stock. So in this graph, for instance, we see the performance of the shipping stocks across different sectors over a period of time, and we see that different sectors tend to perform differently depending on the state of the shipping cycle. So occasionally we might find that dry bulk may outperform the gas sector or in fact the container ship sector, although this may change. For over the last few years, container sector has done extremely well, followed by the gas sector and more recently the tanker sector and the dry bulk. So even in that, what this example here actually demonstrates is that shipping is not only one sector. Shipping consists of different sectors that can potentially attract different types and different breeds of investors. Now, a very important aspect of shipping investment is who is actually buying shipping companies, who actually invests in shipping companies. And initially, shipping stocks were viewed something as a novelty, something that was particular for a very specific and niche class of investors. Investors initially, when the first shipping IPOs took place in the 1980s, they were not familiar with the shipping industry or with the shipping market. So they started investing in small amounts, but gradually and over time, they became more familiar. Initially, the very high freight volatility and the opacity of the market were key considerations and concerns. But what we have seen over the last few years is that this is gradually changing. Markets have increased quite a lot in transparency. Markets are also followed much more broadly by equity analysts. There is usually a large number of equity analysts that follows particular shipping stocks. Their role is to educate the market with respect to the latest development and the investment plans of the different companies. And as a result of all these cumulative changes, we have also seen an increasing participation of institutional investors in shipping stocks. So we see, for instance, in this graph, how the participation of institutional investors in shipping stocks increased over time from single digit levels in the early noughties, reaching up to 40 or 50% in certain cases in the more recent period. And this is very important because it indicates that now the shipping market is a mainstream, more or less, investment sector. It is a sector that is followed by smart money across the globe. It is a sector that has attracted the attention of the investment community. And there are a lot more positive stories that we can talk about shipping going forward. Some of the considerations that the investors are looking into shipping stocks can be summarized on this graph. Obviously, the decision to invest depends to a large extent on the outside economic environment. What is the state of the world economy? How financial markets are doing, as well as the state and the performance of seaborne trade. Equally, knowledge of the subject matter is important. So, in other words, to have a good understanding of the shipping industry. The shipping industry is, as I mentioned, a niche sector. It is a very volatile sector, so any investor needs to be familiar with that volatility. Equally, the management of these risks is quite an important aspect of shipping operations, and it is something that most shipping companies manage to do quite well. Another important factor is, of course, the state of the company. So here one looks at factors such as chartering strategy, quality of management, cash flow stability, but also the fleet quality. And finally, factors related to the size of the company, to the managerial capacity of the company, to the expertise of the company, but also with respect to the financial performance of the company. For instance, the level of gearing, dividend policy, use of proceeds from raising capital, fleet renewal, etc., etc. So these are all considerations that investors are looking when it comes to investing into ships. And more recently, within this overall very comprehensive list, we can also add the consideration of the ESG investing. And ESG investing is becoming more and more commonplace in the industry. It is one of the key words that you hear more and more frequently. It is very important, not only in shipping, it is something that started in other industries, but is becoming increasingly important for shipping companies, and especially shipping companies looking at accessing capital globally. There are a number of requirements that effectively impose these conditions onto shipping companies. There are various regulations that shipping companies and operators must comply and adhere to at the different stages of a ship's life cycle, starting from how the vessel is being built, taking that all the way down to how the vessel is scrapped at the end of her useful economic life. And the drivers of sustainability are mostly driven by national and international sustainability commitment, a number of important bilateral or multinational agreements, but also you have factors that we see more and more often, such as stakeholder activism. Stakeholder activism is becoming important in the mainstream finance sectors. It's not something we have seen in shipping so far, but it is something that shapes company policy. Equally, we have parameters such as media focus as well as public pressures. So as a result of all these conditions and requirements, increasingly, companies and financial institutions have been setting ambitious climate and broader sustainability goals, which will impact their lending behavior. There is, as a result of that, far greater scrutiny of companies and their sustainability credentials from both a regulatory and a public perspective, and regulation is being developed both nationally as well as more broadly globally to support and encourage sustainable finance and sustainable supply chains. So these are the important considerations that will shape the industry going forward. And of course, sustainability does matter because you have a number of numerous international initiatives that have shaped the sustainability agenda. So that starts with very global agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, but equally we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and within the banking sector, we have the Net Zero Banking Alliance, looking at the banking sector more broadly. And with respect to shipping sectors, we have the Poseidon Principles that effectively mandates that signatory bank must monitor the carbon footprint of the fleets they finance, and they must provide financing in such a way so that they can achieve their net zero target by 2050. In addition to these high-level requirements, considerations, and agreements, we also have a number of specific sustainable finance products that have emerged in the market. They come in different varieties, flavors, as well as structures, but very, very broadly speaking, they fall into two separate categories. One is the category of a dedicated green or social project, in which case you have a project that is, you have financing for a project that is specifically related to some environmental considerations, or you can have a sustainability linked loan or bond, which is a loan that is extended for general corporate purposes, not necessarily only environmental, but a corporate purpose that is linked with some measurable KPIs, key performance indicators. Some of these KPIs can be environmental, but they could also cover social and other corporate governance issues. This is the overall area of green loans, social loans, and sustainability-linked loans, as well as bonds, is something that has grown in size extensively over the last few years. I guess the growth that we see in the total level of green investments follows to large extent the awareness about ESG-related issues over the later part of the last decade, as well as the far more greater awareness that we have seen about these products more recently. We can see that all these structures vary in terms of these instruments effectively fluctuate over time, but all in all, we see a positive trend and increasing in the total level that these forms of financing provide. Of course, you have different structures and different types there. It is interesting to see which one of those structures can be more relevant for shipping. So here we delineate the key features of a green or social loan versus a sustainability-linked loan. In the case of a green loan, you have a form of financing that provides investors with transparent use of funds. It is relatively easy to report, and it provides a transparent link of funds to specific projects. And these projects must be related to some environmental aspect. It could be, for instance, installing scrubbers or installing dual fuel fire capability on a vessel, or ordering vessels that burn LNG or have dual fire capability, and so on and so forth. The disadvantages of green loans is that the funds are unavailable for general use and to support working capital needs. So in other words, there are some restrictions in terms of how these funds are going to be used. Usually a bond is classified as a green or a social bond following an accreditation process by organizations such as the Loan Market Association. On the other hand, sustainability-linked loans are a little bit more flexible because they enable borrowers to use funds for a wider range of purposes. So it can not only be environmental considerations, they can also be more broad corporate considerations. So can be used to fund projects that have not yet specifically been identified. And as such, they give a little bit more flexibility to the borrowers. At the same time, you need to be very specific in terms of how you use the funds. So the KPIs need to be considered very, very carefully. And also you need to have measurable targets. So I will focus in a little bit more detail on the sustainability-linked loans. These are loans and bonds as well that incentivize borrowers to improve their sustainability performance via the achievement of predetermined sustainability performance targets. They generally consist of 5 core components. The first component has to do with the choice of the key performance indicators. These key performance indicators must be related to ESG parameters. So far, the vast majority of the deals that we have seen have been focusing on the environmental or on the E aspect of ESG, such as, for instance, improvements in the efficiency ratios or improvements in the carbon footprint of the fleet, so a measurable target that has very much an environmental focus. But this is gradually changing. So over the last couple of years, we have seen as well some sustainability-linked loans with KPIs related to factors such as crew welfare, gender diversity in leadership roles, social and corporate responsibility, etc., etc. And these are all aspects which are very important for shipping companies. I mean, shipping companies are very, very careful in terms of how they take care of their crew. So if you have that as a measurable target, that obviously is an added bonus and an added incentive. The second consideration is the calibration of the sustainability performance targets. So in other words, you translate the far more broad KPIs into something that is a little bit more tangible and, most importantly, more measurable, something that you can measure, something that you can quantify, and something that you can track each performance. So you can see how your actions will change the measure, and therefore will lead you closer to achieving the target. The third aspect of an SSLT is the characteristic of the loan agreement. And now this is where the innovation lies, because the idea is that as a borrower, if you achieve the targets that you have set, then there should be a reward. And that reward could be in the form of a reduction in the spread of the loan, an improvement in the payment terms, an improvement in the level of the covenant. So there should be some financial reward for the borrower when these targets are being met. Of course, these targets have to be publicly reported and measured. So there needs to be some sort of reporting and public disclosure. So this is an essential part of the process because that is, in fact, the part of the process that introduces trust into the system. And finally, these measures will need to be independently verified by auditors and by outside participants that will help verify not only the exact measurement, but also that the targets have been achieved. Over the last few months in shipping, we have seen a number of such deals. So this is just a very, very recent extract of deals that took place over the last couple of months. You can see, for instance, cases that have raised significant amount of money. So one interesting case is case of Gaslog. They raised 2.8 billion US dollars. This is to pay off existing debt, but also to achieve not only decarbonization, but also social KPI targets. So you see, therefore, there is obviously the green element, but there is also a much more broad and equally important social element. And there are a number of new deals that are taking place every month. So this is a very fast-moving and expanding space, and something that is going to shape the industry going forward. Having now discussed about sustainability-linked deals, it is important to go back and discuss in a little bit more detail the process of decarbonization. Obviously, within the ESG space, the letter E has dominated S and G, so it is only natural that we spend a little bit more time looking at the E consideration. So even in the case of shipping, we have seen a very rapid growth in green and sustainability linked bonds. So we can see how the volume of transaction has grown over the more recent years. And I think it is generally accepted in the industry right now that these instruments form a very important part in the industry. And there is now the generally accepted consensus that to a large extent, carbon pricing will impact credit rating. This is going to become far more commonplace from 2024 when the EU ETS mechanism will be considered into the cost of freight for vessels calling at European ports. So we'll see a direct correspondence between the freight rate that the user of freight services is paying and the emissions of the vessel that was used in the transportation. So that will force all participants in shipping industry to look at the environmental profile, not only of their vessels, but of their supply chains far more broadly going forward. And as it stands right now, banks that finance ships look at primarily the cash flow position of the ship owner, the creditworthiness of the ship owner, and all requirements and parameters related to the financial performance of the ship owner. So sooner or later, one additional aspect that will come more into focus will be the environmental credentials of the fleet, the environmental profile of the vessel, factors such as vessel fuel efficiency, carbon footprint, utilization, etc., etc. So this is going to affect, this is going to make companies or even ships more attractive than others, will have an impact on companies that own the different ships, and will also be a differentiating factors between companies that are innovative, well managed, and well capitalized versus those that are not. Of course, this is a road that has a number of, I may use the word obstacles. Obviously, you have substantial upfront expenses. According to different estimates, the cost of decarbonizing fleet can be ranges from 1.4 to 1.9 or even 2 trillion US dollars. This represents significant investment. It represents a significant upfront investment, and it is a level of investment that cannot be sustained by the shipping industry alone. On top of that, you also have a number of other structural issues within the shipping industry that will also affect the willingness to invest. One is the issue of the misalignment of incentives or split incentives, as we say, between the owners of the assets and the users of the freight. Owners will have to make the investment in new capacity or new technology in order to improve their fleet. So they will have to pay for the cost of decarbonizing shipping. Ultimately, it is the user of freight that will pay for the pollution that shipping is causing. So the key principle here is the principle that the polluter pays. But in the case of shipping, you can have a number of commercial arrangements between the different parties that can create some conflicting interests between the owners and the charterers. So empirically, for instance, we have seen that any improvements in fuel efficiency, in the case of improvements in fuel efficiency, you only have a partial pass-through. So not all the savings are passed on from the charterer to the owner. So that creates an interesting situation that is not necessarily an environment that incentivizes investment from the owner's point of view. Equally, we have a very competitive industry. This is an industry that is driven primarily by cost minimization. So that is the opposite from what would be required to make these investments in green technology. And the third factor, which is very important, it is a fragmented industry, especially in transshipping. So one statistic is that 70% of owners control less than 20 ships. And that in itself poses challenges in the sense that smaller owners may not have access to capital or access to technology to the same extent as larger owners. And of course, we should never forget that shipping markets are among the most volatile asset classes. High volatility means uncertainty. Uncertainty is never good for investment. So there is a lot of ESG-induced hesitancy to invest, driven by, among other things, very high freight volatility. So these are the sort of constraints that put restrictions in access and availability of finance. To a large extent, access to finance is generally determined by size, or I may add as well, brand name as well, the brand name of the ship owner. It's also important. Larger companies that have reliable and diversified revenue streams and greater reserves are considered more resilient counterparties by commercial banks. And for the small and medium-sized enterprises, the ability to raise debt finance may be impeded by lack of internal equity and the perception of lower credit quality. On top of that, as we've already established, decarbonization of shipping is a costly process. The shipping market is fragmented, and that means that smaller and medium-sized ship owners may fall behind their larger counterparts, not only because they may not have access to finance, which is one factor, but also because they have lack of access or availability of technology. So we have already seen some collaborations between larger players in the industry and technology companies that provide ESG-related solutions. So it remains therefore to be seen in terms of what is going to happen to the industry, but there is the bottom line that there is a funding gap. So the question is, who can fill actually the funding gap? So we come back to how I started my presentation. I believe that institutional investors are a key in that respect. They are the largest pool of capital with global assets under management valued at over 80 trillion US dollars. They are very experienced investors, and then they are investors that are attracted to sectors that offer unique risk return profile. And shipping is one of those sectors because of its unique risk-return characteristics, because of the fact that it provides the bloodlines for the global economy, and also, and most interestingly, it is a sector that has embarked on a very ambitious decarbonization program, but it is also a sector that is at the forefront of ESG-related activities. So you can have a very interesting narrative where shipping provides the bloodlines of the global economy, but also it's at the forefront of ESG-linked investment. Second factor, financial innovation. So we've seen some of the products such as sustainability-linked loans. They can be structured in a way so that used by companies to meet environmental KPIs. Equally, in order to cater for the smaller owners within the sector, boutique finance can provide bespoke financing. So that would be a form of financing that would be especially helpful for smaller companies. And finally, one very interesting sector, but possibly a sector that is more or less untapped by shipping markets, is the sector of mass affluent investors. Shipping is a niche sector. Shipping is a sector that is not easily accessible by small-scale investors, but there are now innovations in the industry that can achieve that, and in fact can make shipping not only attractive but also accessible to a new breed of investors. So we have developments such as ETFs, tokenization, as well as other innovations that will shape the industry going forward. So I conclude, therefore, with these thoughts. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you at the Q&A session later on. Thank you very much. 감사합니다. Thank you.